Hello, this time on Sitrep.
Any unacceptable behaviour is unwelcome in defence.
We have still got some distance to go in bringing confidence to all of the women in the service that they will be heard.
It angers me that those people are having to fight their own people before they get in front of the enemy.
And the damage, and I've seen this personally, the damage that this can do to those victims and survivors can be enormous.
Ministers and service chiefs are talking the talk against bullying, discrimination and harassment of women in the armed forces. But we've heard similar talk for a long time, so are they walking the right walk? They have announced that complaints about the most serious unacceptable behaviours will be taken out of the single services and put in the hands of a new tri-service team away from the chain of command. But is it enough? We'll explain how the changes work and talk to two experienced veterans about the scale of unacceptable behaviours and how best they can be stopped.
Sitrep with Gerbeau.
Well, Mike is out today, but we do have some eminent guests ready to discuss the unacceptable behaviours faced by women in the armed forces and the job of stopping those behaviours. But before I bring in our panel, I just want to take a little time to understand the new complaints system and task force that have been announced by ministers and service chiefs. They revealed the plan just a few hours before facing a grilling from MPs on the Commons Defence Committee. Well, BFBS Forces news reporter Rosie Layden is here to explain all. Rosie has spent many years covering these issues and was in the room for that session with MPs. Rosie, good to have you on Sitrep again. Can we just start by explaining the change to the way complaints about unacceptable behaviours will be handled?
Well, this is an announcement from the MOD about a new specialist tri-service team to tackle the most serious complaints raised by serving personnel. So that is bullying, discrimination and harassment. This unit is going to sit outside the single service chain of command, and the MOD say it will provide individuals with greater confidence and help ensure the most serious complaints are dealt with quickly, fairly and in a standardised way across the armed forces. This is designed to build on change which was brought in 2022 as part of the MOD response to the Sarah Atherton report into women in the armed forces. And at that point, they took complaints out of the chain of command which relate to sexual offences. And in fact, at that time, it was asked, well, can you not do the same for bullying, harassment and discrimination? They chose not to then, but this is what they're doing now.
And Rosie, one important element of this is who will be handling the complaints instead of the single services. Do we know anything about the makeup of the new unit?
Well, we don't know much, and they were asked to give a bit more detail on this by the committee. They will be outside the single service chain of command, but they will be serving personnel. They'll be a reasonably senior level. Again, I wasn't quite clear exactly at what point they will sit, but you assume there'll be a certain seniority to deal with these complaints effectively. And yes, they really do need to provide a bit more transparency around that so that people can have confidence in this kind of a system.
And then, Rosie, there is a Violence Against Women and Girls task force. Just explain that for us, will you?
Well, as I understand it, the Tri-Service Unit is going to deal with complaints. The Violence Against Women and Girls Task Force is to deal with allegations being made. And Al Khan's, the Minister for Veterans and People who was at the hearing, said that he himself is going to lead this. And his idea is that, he can make sure that everything flows from him, goes across defence. And that's the idea of that. What this will be is described as to include regional support network, people who will be trained on topics including domestic violence and sexual offending, and the roles that make up this network will use multidisciplinary experts to support armed forces personnel, including healthcare providers, social workers, HR advisors, and they will link into the Victim Witness Care Unit. So it sounds quite ambitious.
And before we talk about how the plan has gone down with MPs, I just want to share a couple of minutes from this session because it gives a real sense of the mood in the room and an idea of the scale of the problem. This is Liberal Democrat MP Mike Martin, himself an Army veteran, talking to the head of the Army, General Sir Rowley Walker.
I know, General, that you're aware of the more than 1,000 women who shared stories on Fill Your Boots, which is a social media account about being raped and abused and harassed. And I'm just going to read some of them out here, just to put them on the record. I used to hold my breath in my room at night when they were trying the door to make them think I was out. Another one. I was being bullied and harassed by a senior commissioned officer. I raised it, but it was ignored. Another one. A sergeant kicked me to the floor, pinned me down, acted out a sex act on me in front of a warrant officer. Nothing was ever done. There's another one. I was coming back from the toilet one day when a bloke came out of the showers, pinned me against the wall, dropped his towel and told me that he knew exactly what I needed. It goes on. You know, one time I hadn't locked my door. The man walked in, looked me dead in the eyes and smiled at me. When I didn't smile back, he moved towards me until I yelled at him to get out. Thankfully, he did leave, but then nothing was ever done.
This is some of what General Walker had to say in response.
Like you, I can tell by the way you're reading those stories how upset they make you feel, how angry they make me feel, how ashamed I am as the head of the army that those are what our soldiers are reporting. I mean, I share probably, we've soldiered together, we know what this feels like. So I come at this from a position of anger, of emotion, and of a desire like you to see some form of justice or reconciliation. It hurts me that young people volunteer to join our army, citizens volunteer to fight for this country. Combat is hard enough as it is when everything's on the line and the only thing you've got is your teamwork around you to keep you safe. It angers me that those people are having to fight their own people before they get in front of the enemy. So I'm with you, this is a chain of command responsibility.
No doubt there, Rosie, that everyone agrees on the seriousness and the scale of the problems. The question is, do they agree whether what's just been announced and what's come before is enough?
Well, the committee didn't appear convinced that these announcements are the answer in themselves. The chair, Tan DC, also expressed cynicism about the timing of the announcement immediately ahead of the evidence session and displeasure that the committee hadn't been given prior notice of these. They were keen to get actual examples of action and discipline and dismissal flowing from the zero tolerance policy introduced in 2022. And they really wanted to get beyond the commitment to do better and even the warm words around saying, you know, how terrible this was. They wanted tangible signs of improvement.
And General Walker was clear, prevention of the unacceptable behaviours that women face is a chain of command responsibility. But the MPs seemed unconvinced at times that senior officers are facing consequences, ultimately dismissal, if they fail to stop, or even worse, they allow such behaviours.
Yeah, well, I thought this was one of the most interesting points that the committee dealt with and that came out from this. And obviously, once people give evidence here, things are placed on the record. So that's very significant. Attending alongside the service chiefs was Sam Day Ford. She's the Director of Conduct, Equity and Justice at the MOD. So she gave some figures. She said over 100 people have been kicked out of the armed forces due to unacceptable sexual behaviours, sexual relationships between senior ranks and juniors. And they went round the room basically saying, what have you done? What have you done? You know, what's happened on your watch? Rowley Walker, as you heard there, the head of the army, very passionate and emotional in his response. He said, as regards zero tolerance, 31 people have been convicted of sex offences, 28 have been discharged, 3 weren't discharged but subject to Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. So he was saying, you know, we are dealing it, we're dismissing people, we've dismissed generals, we've dismissed colonels and majors. So, you know, they were pushing back on that. Ben Key, the First Sea Lord, said that they had also taken action. He referenced the allegations brought by Sophie Brooke against when she was serving in the submarine service. And he said that they had treated her as if she was still serving. He made quite a big thing about that. Even though she'd left the service, they'd had a whole inquiry, which we're all aware of around that. And he said that as a result of her evidence and her case, and also other people who came forward, he said 3 people were directly dismissed from the service relating to her allegations, and 18 were dismissed as a result of the wider evidence.
And if we look at the picture over time, this task force is the latest in a series of changes. The Defence People Minister told the MPs they've now implemented most of the recommendations from the committee's Atherton report, but there are still a couple to go and some that they have rejected totally.
Yes. So at the top of the session, Al Khan's went through that. He said that we've accepted and addressed all recommendations. There's only 2 left. He mentioned the sexual harassment survey, which he said they were due to push out in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And the committee did get a bit annoyed about that. They're like, well, that was due to come out last year, and why is it taking so long? And he said, well, we want to standardise it across government. Otherwise, there's no comparison. But apparently that's coming in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And he also said the female veteran strategy, so the new veteran strategy, will have a specifically female component, which was something that Atherton report criticised for not being present. He said they haven't accepted 3, and he said they don't accept the recognition of military-specific sexual trauma. And he said that the MOD continues to reject the idea that all sexual offending should be referred to civilian police. Now, that's something that Sarah Atherton is very strong on. It's come up before her time, and it's something which the family of Jaisley Beck called for following her inquest as well. So, I was interested in what he had to say about that, but I do wonder that the MOD sort of continues to stand by that.
Rosie, we'll talk a bit more later, but as you mentioned Sarah Atherton and her review and recommendations when she sat on the Defence Committee, it seems like a good time to talk to Sarah. As well as being a veteran of the House of Commons, she is also a veteran of the Armed Forces, having served in the Army's Intelligence Corps. Welcome once again, Sarah. Good to see you again.
Thank you for having me on your show.
And also with us is Commodore Steve Prest. His 25 years in the Royal Navy included the role of Deputy Director, People Change in 2023. He served as a gender advocate for the Royal Navy and Ministry of Defence as well. Good to see you, Steve.
Great to be back, Kate. Thanks for having me.
Right, well, to help prevent bullying, harassment and discrimination against women in the forces, we need to understand exactly what is happening and, if possible, identify the causes. And I think it's probably useful to hear from both of you from your own experiences to start with. Sarah, did you directly experience unacceptable behaviours?
I was in the army back in the 80s, and it was a seriously tough gig back then. But I was in the Intelligence Corps, where there is more women then and there is now. And I think in any environment where there are more women, you don't get to see as much of this behaviour that we're hearing about. So I didn't actually experience it. I know it went on then, and I also know it goes on now.
What about you, Steve? Did you witness it?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's really important to recognise is that some of the very bad behaviour, some of the stuff that crosses, a criminal threshold or a grievance threshold, a complaint threshold, actually is really the sort of tip of the iceberg. Because I think what is important is that there is a culture in the armed forces which we're working to change, and the chiefs, this week in the House of Commons Defence Committee, committed to work to change, where actually it's just harder for women because there's a whole load of rubbish they have to deal with, whether it's inappropriate language or assumptions about their capability or having to justify their competence, where there are assumptions made, and that sort of culture where women face headwinds that men don't means that life is harder. And then as you work up the seriousness scale of those things, there are then a bunch of actions which that culture permits, which then cross those thresholds into some of the really serious behaviour we've seen.
And Sarah, you heard many, many more stories, though, when you ran your 2021 inquiry into this, didn't you?
Yes, actually, it was one of the largest inquiries run in Parliament. I wasn't expecting what we found, but we had 4,106 pieces of evidence. For the first time, I was permitted to have access to serving personnel because, until then, there's a defence instruction notice, which means they can't speak to MPs about their service. Now, the Secretary of State then, Ben Wallace, lifted that. So I had access to service personnel and veterans. And the stories were quite horrific. And even now, I'm no longer in Parliament. I'm still doing a lot of advocacy and campaigning work for defence. Service personnel reach out on average once a fortnight to me asking for help. So that's why I know the situation has not improved. Now, we know that complaints have doubled in 3 years. The Minister and the Defence Committee says it's because of extra confidence in the system, and he may have a point there. But I also think that service personnel are no longer going to tolerate what's going on, and they have the benefit of social media. So they can control the narrative more than they could do a few years ago when a lot of things were held quite tightly within the MOD. So I think they are more empowered to speak up. Change is happening, albeit far too slowly, but it certainly goes on just as much now, and it is equally as relevant to men as well as women.
And Steve, when you witnessed unacceptable behaviours during your career, or that culture, even if it was not evolving into action that was unacceptable, did you feel able to challenge it at the time?
Yes, I think so. But when it's part of the culture, so if you go back to the 1990s, when I first joined the Navy and was first involved, this was an era of lads mags, girl power, men behaving badly. And happily and quite rightly, the culture has evolved, and awareness of the impact of some of these things on our female colleagues has evolved. And so we can all choose to be better. But it does take people like me to sit down and listen. And I had a moment, if you like, of awakening when a couple of women who were working for me in HMS Queen Elizabeth were brave enough. And it does take a great degree of courage to expose your vulnerability in this way to male colleagues in particular, of just what it was like to be a woman in the Royal Navy. And I had no idea. I mean, why would I have? Because, I'd never experienced any of these things. And they laid it out for me over, probably an hour or so. And it was an unplanned conversation. And I listened and I just thought, well, this isn't right. This isn't okay. Firstly, it's not fair, because they're not getting a fair crack of the whip. So we don't have a proper meritocracy. We're not getting the best talent through. And secondly, they have to put up with a load of nonsense, some of it very unpleasant, some of it that crosses a criminal threshold, that they shouldn't have to. So we've got to do something about it. And that's how I got involved. But every woman I talk to in the armed forces, when they open up and when they're prepared to share their experience, has at least one story to tell.
And Steve, really interesting that you said that moment when those two women came forward and talked to you on HMS Queen Elizabeth, it was an awakening. I mean, what did they tell you that you didn't know or hadn't properly recognised before?
So we were having a conversation about gender pay gaps and differences in pay for men and women doing the same jobs. And I said, well, we don't have that problem in the armed forces, because we all know what we get paid. If you're a commander of a certain seniority, you get paid the same amount irrespective of gender. And because we're a meritocracy, then that's fine, isn't it? And they just sort of looked at me and then they looked at each other and there was this sort of unspoken, are you going to tell him or am I? And it was just the sort of day-to-day small things about what you might call microaggressions, the use of language, assumptions about their career versus their spouses. I had a colleague reach out to me just this week, our former colleague reached out to me just this week, who's pregnant. I won't go into specifics for obvious reasons, but one of her managers had made a decision based on assumptions of what was going to happen to her that there was at risk of disadvantaging her. Now, it wasn't done through malice, it wasn't done through, but it just shouldn't have happened. In the end, it got sorted out. But it won't appear in any statistics because there'll be no complaint raised, it got sorted. But it's the sort of emotional load that puts on service women that blokes don't have to put up with, which all kind of adds up. And then, yes, some of that then does create a culture that permits the stuff that then gusts towards proper inappropriate behaviour to happen without either being noticed or without being addressed.
And Sarah, you're nodding there, and it's really interesting what Steve said, that kind of problem won't appear in any statistics. Complaints are up, but we're told that's because reporting has improved. It's very difficult to have an accurate picture, isn't it, of how widespread women's experience of unacceptable behaviour is.
Okay, I always think there's lies, damn lies and statistics. And having 5 years in Parliament, I know statistics can prove whatever you like. Certainly stats, statistics, recording, surveys were mentioned a lot in the Defence Committee and was used either way to defend or attack. It is very difficult to get a true picture of the situation. It's very difficult to get a true picture from the MOD of the situation. And it's very difficult to get information from them. It was mentioned in the evidence session that the sexual harassment survey results are very hard to get hold of. They haven't been released for 2024, and the Centre of Military Justice can't get hold of the outcomes for 2023. So there's always this doubt about what is actually going on. We know from my inquiry that 6 out of 10 don't report. So anyone that does report, I suspect, is a tip of the iceberg, and they have got nowhere else to go. They can't sort it out at low level, or they've tried to and it's not worked. So what we're seeing, and I'm still confident in saying this, there's a lot more going on that we don't know. And certainly from the contacts I'm having, we've got a widespread endemic cultural issue in the military. And this is not just proportionate to women. This is across the board. And I didn't know, but I heard that after my inquiry, the MOD engaged Professor Anthony King to do a cultural audit of the military. His results were never published, but it is well thought that the culture throughout the armed forces is corrupt. And this is another example of how the MOD are trying to control the narrative. So I think there's a wider issue here that the MOD are now realising and waking up to. And it's just not an environment for women, it's across the armed forces.
And Steve, you've been a civilian for just over a year now. When you see it from the outside, how big a difference do you see how women are treated in the workplace now? And has it influenced your behaviours? And do you see things differently now that you're no longer in the armed forces?
I don't think I see things hugely differently, actually. I think it entirely depends on the circumstances you find yourself in. Sarah said earlier, there's a sort of critical mass of women in an organisation that makes a difference to how women are perceived by the other people in that organisation. And I think where in areas where I work, where women are in the majority, or at least sort of over 30%, then you see pretty good behaviours. In my last couple of jobs in the Navy, certainly when I was Director Navy Acquisition, actually our organisation there was a majority female organisation. It was the first area in the armed forces I'd worked, and most of those were civil servants. But that had a really positive culture. And I think it's worth saying that there are some examples of exceptionally good leadership and exceptionally good cultures in the Royal Navy. I know of submarines who've won awards at the Women in Defence Awards for the quality of their leadership and their inclusion and their integration of women into the ship's companies of those boats. And that's really good news. And what we should be doing is looking for those examples of really good leadership, of the people who are getting it right, and then propagate that across the service. Because everybody in the service can choose to do and be better in this regard.
And Sarah, Steve there saying that there are areas where the culture is good. In the places where it isn't, what are the causes?
As Steve mentioned, I think where there are fewer women, that is an issue. And we have this term toxic pockets. Women on deployment and detachment and in operations where they're very much alone or with a few female colleagues, they seem to experience far more intimidation, harassment, bullying, and sexual inappropriate behaviour. So we've got an issue here. I was surprised that at the Defence Committee there wasn't more talk about culture, bystander culture, which I think is a really big issue, which wasn't really tackled this week on the session. And I think these are the areas that we need to concentrate on. There is excellent work going out there. I tend to find they are person-led. So it depends on that person whether it's working. And that's not really good enough.
Yeah, I think that's right. So where it works really well and you've got leaders who get it and create the right environment, the right culture, which is I would argue is about, no more or less than understanding the people in your organisation will experience that organisation differently from you, and making sure that you maximise the performance of your team through the realisation of the potential of every individual in it. And that means treating those individuals as individuals and recognising what matters to them, and making sure the whole team is supporting everyone else in the team. So women aren't seen as other, and they're not seen as something that can be predated upon, but they're seen as us, and therefore we look after them like they look after us because they're one of us. That's really good leadership. Where that doesn't work, it can be awful. And I've got a family friend who's recently left the army, And so this is a pretty recent case study. She was one of the only women in a logistics regiment. She raised a complaint about bullying, sort of misogynistic bullying. There wasn't a sexualized element to it, but she was treated appallingly. That complaint was upheld. She remained in the unit. The bullying got worse and she left. Yeah. And that's where, and this is in recent months. So there are pockets where it's terrible, and there are pockets like the submarines I mentioned where it's completely brilliant, and people want to serve, and the women in there can't speak highly enough of the culture, and they want to be part of that team. I think my point is we know what good looks like. The work needs to be to take that good culture and actively propagate it across the service, and then deal with the people at whatever level who are not prepared to embrace that way of working.
And Sarah mentioned these toxic pockets, and the Chief of the General Staff talked about the association of masculinity with soldiering as a barrier to integration. But is it simply the case that masculinity would dominate in any organisation that's nearly 90% men?
Well, I think that's partly true, but I also think there is we're seeing the idea that women should play an equal part in these sorts of organisations, and the fact that they can be as, if not more competent than men, and have real value to add in organisations like defence. Something which we thought was a pretty settled idea now being contested. And we look across the Atlantic and we look at some of the sort of toxic masculinity from the likes of Andrew Tate and others. And actually the idea that women have a proper role to play in the defence of our nation is becoming again a contested idea. And so we need to actively advocate for the value that women bring. Why would you not want these brilliant people who could do great work in your organisation? And actually, what that masculinity brings with it is a fragility of ego. Because if you're threatened by the idea that a woman could do your job just as well, if not better than you, then frankly, you're probably not very good at your job, and you don't really believe that you are. So that's sort of the conversation we need to have as well. But we've also got in society, a load of men and boys, particularly from white working class environments, who feel disengaged from society and who feel, rightly or wrongly, like they've been disadvantaged and left behind. So that is something both societally and from an armed forces point of view that we need to address the toxicity of it, so that this isn't seen as some sort of zero-sum game. It's a game where everyone can be better and everyone can win.
The Chief of General Staff spoke about societal shift, and he was talking about toxic masculinity and saying, well, there's a problem in society. We're going to have a problem in the army. And the army, well, it's a larger service, first of all, than the other two services, but there seems to be more of an issue in that service. He can't abrogate his responsibility to try and change. It's not a race to the bottom to try and change and address some of these issues. A lot of the organisations were upset about his comments around that, saying he was victim blaming. I think he's probably got a point, and I think there is an issue here that does need to be addressed, but it doesn't mean he just sort of throws his hands up and says, well, I'm on a losing wicket. He has to step up and show that he is leading the service. He is going to uphold the leadership values that we expect from a professional military. And certainly leadership wasn't touched on at all, I don't think, in that session. And we are seeing some immoral leadership decisions being made within the chain of command around complaints. So our conversation, I'm just listening about where this conversation is going. And, women have progressed. Equality and support have progressed for women a long way in just 5 years. And, we've got the first captain of the flagship, the carrier, the Queen Elizabeth, Claire Thompson. This is fantastic where we're going. But, a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been picked now. We've got kit, uniform, health policies, wraparound childcare. We've got the more uncomfortable issues around MST, military sexual trauma, rape in civilian courts that have or haven't been dealt with. I don't think they've been dealt with, and I don't think they will be in the foreseeable future. But everything we're talking about here is about leadership, and it's about culture, and it's about morals, ethics, and professionalism. And this is the next obstacle I think we need to address.
So let's try and put some of this to good use and talk about preventing this mistreatment of women. And in that light then, Sarah, how much difference will the change to the handling of the complaints actually make?
I'm cautiously optimistic. So since 2021, I've been campaigning for the removal of the chain of command from sexual complaints, serious complaints, and also for it to be taken out of the single services. So the announcement, which happened a few hours before the Defence Committee sat, which itself is quite telling, but the announcement I'm cautiously welcoming. The devil is always in the detail. We have very little detail about this. I hope it's not a rebadging of the central admissibility team setup, which is what they put in place as a response to my report in 2021, which was quite ineffectual. I hope it's not a rebadge of that. There are lots of questions asked about, are they going to bring in external experts? Is it going to be the same staff that's transferred over? Are they going to get additional training? Which cases are going to go? Because they're saying at the moment it's the most serious cases. What are those most serious cases? What happens to the cases that aren't? Is it going to have enough capacity? Defence Serious Crimes Unit, the Victim and Witness Support Unit don't have an awful lot of capacity. You know, what really is this going to look like? And is it going to make a real difference? Because the MOD are running out of options if this doesn't work.
And Steve, are there any negatives? Because the principle of commanders having disciplinary power has long been core to the forces.
Yeah, and of course, one of the advantages of the chain of command having those sorts of disciplinary powers in the broadest sense is that summary justice can be done swiftly and be seen to be done, and then everyone can move on and get on with it. So particularly in the days when, you know, ships were away for extended periods of time, there was no other option really to deliver justice expeditiously than to put it in the hands of the chain of command. And that's the tradition that we have inherited. Now, what was right for then isn't necessarily right for today, and quite rightly we need to look at it and challenge it. But it doesn't mean that everything about that is flawed. But we do need to make sure that we get it right, and that where there are victims of these sorts of appalling acts, that they have the right to access the sort of justice that will work for them and will actually deliver, you know, a fair outcome and a just outcome, and the perpetrators will be dealt with appropriately. And by the way, I genuinely believe, and I know personally, and I've worked with personally a number of the people who are on that panel in front of the House of Commons Defence Committee, I believe they are people of integrity, and I genuinely believe it when they say they are horrified by the reports that are coming out, and I genuinely think they are committed to doing something about it. But I think that there also potentially generates a cognitive dissonance in them, that the system that they have grown up through and that ultimately has selected them for high office could be fundamentally flawed and therefore in need of reform in some of the ways that we've been talking about today, and Sarah in particular has described. And I think that creates a cognitive dissonance. So to know what good looks like, because their experience of it has obviously been, perhaps not universally, but broadly positive if they've gone through their careers. Otherwise, they wouldn't be where they are. So to understand what it's like for people who haven't experienced that sort of career, you know, requires all sorts of engagement through the service women's networks, meeting and talking with victims and understanding what it is like to be a woman in those forces in a candid way.
Sarah, if we take what Steve just said, that the system may be flawed and in need of some kind of reform, talking about the kind of recommendations that you've made before, if they were to be implemented, the ones that have been rejected, what kind of a difference would that make?
Morale is low, remains low in the military. We are seeing shoots of progress within recruitment, albeit minuscule, but morale is really low. They have mistrust in the complaint system. They read the papers, they read the news, they see what's happening in other parts of the military. And I think that has to start by demonstrating, and the service chiefs demonstrating that they genuinely want to make a change. You could see the look on their faces during that. It was uncomfortable for them. I can sort of say and see now that they, compared to when I started this campaign back in 2021, They have now, albeit the MOD with a twisted arm behind their back, acknowledged there is a problem. That in itself is a massive step from one of the oldest, most male-dominated institutions we have in this country. But they, as Steve said, have been part of a system which served them well. And they are probably very unhappy and uncomfortable about criticising a system that served them well. Now, there are excellent pioneers, people, leaders in our military, male and female. But there are also some that perhaps are too uncomfortable to appreciate the situation they're in. And they want to turn a blind eye. They want it to go away. And I get messages from serving personnel. Every one of them has been a man, although this is not exclusively limited to men. Everyone has been a man who are very unhappy with what I'm doing and tell me so. And, this is going to take a generational change, and it's going to be slow and insidious, but it's whether the military has the time afforded to that to see positive change.
But when they say they're unhappy what you're doing, what do they say to you?
They say that they completely deny what I say on social media. They contact me on email. They deny what I say. They try and challenge it. This is the damn lies and statistics. They try and challenge it. And I'm all for everyone having their own opinions and perceptions of a situation. But they will try and close me down. They will try and cancel me rather than saying, look, let's work together. Let's see what we can do. And then I get accused of woking up the army. And if anyone ever knew me, I'm the least woke person there is. But these are the accusations I get levelled at me for trying to do this work.
Steve, can I just pick up on some of what you said about the submarine service being praised for its inclusion? We also know that last year the First Sea Lord apologised for intolerable misogyny, and a number of people were sacked following investigations into the experiences of a whistleblower, Sophie Brooke, who served between 2014 and 2020. So is your experience just kind of limited, or what's going on there?
So I'm not a submariner, so it would be sort of somewhat invidious for me to speak on the submarine service specifically. But as the First Sea Lord said this week, submarines are a particularly intense environment. We've just seen HMS Vanguard return this week after 204 days on patrol underwater. Now, that's an extraordinary length of time. So what you find, in my experience, is you have a barbell effect. It's either really good or really bad. So if you've got the right environment under those extraordinary pressures where there's nowhere to go and there's nowhere to escape and there's nowhere to go and get some personal space or some time, or you can't talk to people outside of that black tube. If it's really good and the culture is right, then it can be exemplary and an example to everybody else. But if it's bad, then my goodness, it's going to be terrible. And so I think particularly with submarines, because of the nature of that environment, you either see it being really good or really bad. There are some examples, there have been, and there still are some examples of really good leadership. But the sort of thing that you've just mentioned with Sophie Brooke and so on was an example of a terrible culture. And we've seen reports in the media and elsewhere of similar sorts of things. So there is work to be done. I know that the leaders of the submarine service and of the Navy know that work needs to be done and they want to get on with it. Of course, they need to do more. And of course, they need to do it faster. But what we've seen is that it can be done. And that should be a source for great encouragement. And the fact that it can be done should mean our expectation is that it will be done and it will be done quickly.
Sarah, do you want to add to that?
204 days on a deployment. I mean, the question there is why are they having to go out for 204 days in the first place? But that's a different discussion. But one of the things mentioned was safe spaces. Females have to have, women have to have safe spaces. And when you've got such a confined environment like a Vanguard submarine, there is no chance of a safe space. That is just not possible. Couple that with 204 days under the water and no contact with the outside world or family, I think it's very hard for the submarine service to say and put their hand on the heart and say this is a safe place for women, unless they can increase the number of submariners, female submariners on a submarine. If they could get to this critical mass point and deploy a Vanguard submarine with 30% females, then that could be an answer. But I don't know how far, Steve will probably know better than me, how far we are off getting to that point. But there are, good deployments, and it can happen. And therefore, we need to look at what makes that work and make sure that that is propagated across the service.
So I agree with Sarah, but I also think there's a danger to that logic. And I think the danger is that the counter argument could be made to say, well, if women need safe spaces in submarines and safe spaces can't be provided with submarines, then it's perfectly obvious that submarines are no place for a woman. And that we should just, therefore, not put women in submarines. And we go back. And there was an article reported this week about defence chiefs supposedly saying that if women can't be accommodated somewhere with a lock on their door, then they're to be put into a hotel. And whilst that might be expedient in terms of protecting the women in the moment, of course, what you do is you increase the division between female personnel and male personnel. And if you say, well, actually, women shouldn't, therefore can't be in the mess, they have to be separate. Well, why don't we just have a separate service? Let's have a women's Royal Naval Service where we can keep them separate, keep them safe, and then everything will be fine, and the men can all do the going to sea. And that becomes really regressive. Now, I don't believe for a moment that's the right thing to do, because I think we miss out on all of that talent that we absolutely need to bring to bear to defend the nation. So firstly, it's not fair because you're closing down opportunities for people who are perfectly capable of doing those jobs. But secondly, it's not good from an operational capability point of view either, because you miss out on brilliant people who could do great work in defence of the nation. So I wouldn't want to go down that route, but I think we have to be really careful about othering women in that context, perhaps for all the right reasons, that actually increases the division rather than creating a culture where women are seen as part of the in-group and therefore part of us as opposed to being part of something else.
It's a really interesting dilemma, isn't it, when you have Sarah saying safe places, but then also critical mass could be a solution. But if critical mass is just not an option, then you're just going around in circles, aren't you?
Well, you are. And I think the issue of spy holes and locks on the doors, which was a story this week, was perhaps more to do with getting the maintenance contractors to go around and fix these doors quicker than they actually do. So there's always an underlying story there that's not very obvious unless you know a little bit about it. But it is. And Steve is right. We cannot divide. This is about inclusivity. It's about equality. It's not about division. But it's about being realistic. It's about holding the feet of the service chiefs to the fire and saying, do something. We're not going to go backwards. The MOD, the military, cannot afford to go backwards. We do need to increase the recruitment of women. I think we're just gusting 12% of females. It went down slightly. It's coming back up. They want 30% by 2030. The RAF are going one step further, and they wanted 40% by 2030. We need diversity. Women or diverse groups, stop groupthink. We absolutely need women in the military. So we cannot divide. We need to be progressive. We need to go forward. But there needs to be a reality check also. Harrogate is a place that's of concern to me because some of the statistics that are coming out of Harrogate. But that doesn't mean you stop women going to Harrogate. You stop female trainees going to Harrogate. You've just got to address them. And this is why we're having these discussions, because it is highlighting there are problems. And, after 5 years of dealing with the MOD, sometimes social media, sometimes challenging is the only way to progress the story and to get results.
So finally, Sarah, what would you say to young women thinking about joining the forces but worrying what they'll experience because of their gender?
If I was young enough, Kate, I'd go in tomorrow. I think it's a great career, and the vast majority of women have a very successful career. It's moved on phenomenally in the last 5 years. There are areas of concern, yes. But there are areas of concern in every job, in every walk of life in society. But by and large, it's a fantastic career. You can get skills that you couldn't, and experiences, and build relationships that you couldn't anywhere else. So I'd say go for it.
And to you, Steve, men need to be central to the solution, don't they? What would you say to young men thinking of joining the forces about what's expected of them and whether they can be themselves as part of that?
So I think I would say that the business of disheartening and alienating our people is the job of the enemy. And under no circumstances should we be doing the enemy's job for them. We owe it to our shipmates, our oppos, the people we're going to be beside in a fire trench, or the people we're going to be in a cockpit with or in a crew room with, to look after each other and bring out the very best in them. And that should not matter whether they are men or women. That should be how we see each other as people in uniform serving the nation. And if you're up for that, get stuck in and create the armed forces that women and everybody else deserve to serve in. Because the business of making the armed forces fit for women to serve in is not the job of the women. It's the job of everybody, especially the leadership, but we all have a part to play. I was giving a talk at Yeovilton, the Naval Air Station, the other week, and a Phase 2 trainee, he said, that all sounds great, sir, but what can I do? And I said, but you can do that in your group, in your class, in your T-boat and in your mess deck. And you can do that today. You don't have to solve the whole problem, but you can be the change where you are. And he said, I've got it. That's what I'd say to the men joining the armed forces today.
So good to speak to both of you. Thank you so much. Steve Prest and Sarah Atherton, a really interesting discussion. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much.
Well, let's get some final thoughts from Forces News reporter Rosie Layden. Rosie, Mike and I often talk about how changing rules and procedures can be done in a moment, but any cultural change from that takes time. What's your sense of whether ministers and service chiefs plan more changes against unacceptable behaviour, or are going to wait and see whether what they've done over the last few years works?
It's hard to say. I do think that they've announced these 2 new policies. The other thing that they've said that is going to be coming in this year is a new Armed Forces Commissioner. So the bill is going through Parliament at the moment, and they've said that they expect to be appointing someone to this role by the end of the year, and that will replace the Ombudsman. And as far as I can see, looking at the 2 roles, the different powers are that the Commissioner would be able to visit defence sites unannounced, can commission reports, and the idea is that they hold defence to account and drive improvements to service life. The Ombudsman doesn't have those powers, and so would that take things further? Perhaps so, you'd hope so. I kind of think it depends who they appoint to that role as well. You know, that will say something about how far they want to go. I rather think that with those 3 announcements, perhaps that is a sign that they want to sort of see how that beds in and hope for the best rather than repeatedly announcing things. I guess you have to look at the culture. That's what a lot of the MPs were asking about. You know, you have all these initiatives, but are they being driven through by leadership? Are they filtering down? You know, what are the changes in culture? And that's something which, of course, all 3 service chiefs say that they are tackling and they want to tackle, and time will tell if that's going to be borne out.
And you talk, Rosie, to women in the forces a lot in your role. I know you spent a lot of time with young women going through officer training at Sandhurst last year, and we covered it on Sitrep, didn't we? What do you hear when you talk to servicewomen about how concerned they are about bullying, harassment, or much worse? Because it's not everyone's experience, is it?
No, absolutely not. And obviously, if you meeting those young women at Sandhurst was such a privilege and so interesting. They're very much at the beginning of their careers. Clearly, they're enthusiastic. They're there because they want to join the army. They want to lead soldiers. They repeatedly said that. And they say overtly, or it's sort of implicit in the way they're talking, they just want to be judged on their job, on their conduct, and not on their gender. It's so basic, but that's what they want. And there is that enthusiasm there for the job. That nobody openly told me about experiencing bullying, and I wouldn't necessarily expect them to. But I think they were very much, the way they talk, they very much hope that that's the army of the past and that things will be better now they come in. I think we all know that it's not entirely historic and that problems exist and problems remain. And in fact, even the minister acknowledges that, saying we can't eradicate everything. We take this very seriously. We will do our best to drive it down, but it's not going to go away entirely. But yeah, I would just say that, you know, women want to be soldiers, women want to be officers. They don't want to have to deal with all this extra baggage.
Thank you, Rosie, and our thanks to Sarah Atherton and Commodore Steve Prest. That's all for now. Professor Michael Clark will be back with me next Thursday for another Sitrep. In the meantime, if you want to watch Rosie's series, Sandhurst Women Leading the Fight, you can find it by visiting the Forces News YouTube channel. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.